Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Winter, and here is Russ.
Fractal University. Greetings, everyone. We're here with the headmaster, Dan Winter, and today's stories are going to be about Puharich and Bentov. And let's see where we get with this one. How down the rabbit hole we can go.
I've been dreaming about all those memories and sorting them into some serious meaning, and hopefully in the process, creating serious education around this. You know, some people have been asking about Russ here too. Russ is quite a shaman in his own right, and is going to be offering more sort of shamanic consulting soon. In the meantime, Russ has also developed that fractalluna.com, which is an extension of fractalu.com. So you may look there, and soon we'll have more from Russ. It was amazing. The shaman from Odessa, shall we say that, Russ? Or
I like it. I like the ring of that.
okay. So the story to today's Maury has to do with the many years I spent with Ben Bentov, and how that led me to Andrea Puharich. Remember the Deep Space Nine and the meaning of the nine and all that stuff. And many of you remember. I've told the Bentov story so many times, but I just want to see if I can do a share screen here. 1 second, share screen. And here is the Bentov. So everybody remembers Itzhak Ben Bentov, and we have the Bentov documentaries in detail at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. And I was in his lab with him, as you probably may remember, when he was working with the capacitive accelerometer, by which he measured these low frequencies of Kundalini phase locking the liquids of the brain ventricles from the spine liquid pump. And he measured that relationship ingeniously. Remember, he was using a form of a polygraph to do it. And in graduate school psychophysiology, University of Detroit, that was my job. I was a polygraph builder in the psychophysiology clinic with Professor Albert Axe, University of Detroit. So, you know, polygraphs were my thing. Preamplifiers and, you know, transducers and measuring GSR and finger plethysmogram and respirometer. So remember that I had gotten to Boston because after I finished the Gurdjieff School, Sacred Gymnastic, and had all those bliss experiences at Claymont.org in West Virginia, I decided to go hang out with the Gurdjieff community at Windfall in Marshfield, Massachusetts. And we were doing sacred gymnastic and the Gurdjieff work. And at that time, I was adopted by John Richardson at the MIT Space Lab at MIT there in Boston, where he was in charge of driving Cygnus X1, the first X-ray astronomy satellite. And he was at the steering wheel. And he had this amazing computer graphics plotter and allowed me to use that original, I remember this is what, 40 years ago, the computer graphics plotter to plot my first golden ratio embedding holy grail visualizations by equation on the plotters at MIT. So I was having a bit of fun. Anyway, so I ended up staying with Ben Bentov in his lab there with the accelerometer. And then in that process, I began to hear another side of the Andrea Puharich story. And that's really where today's story begins. Okay, now I'm going to stop this share. And I have my Andrea Puharich slides in a moment. But I'd like to back up in the conversation a little bit in case there are those here who don't know who Andrea Puharich was or was. It was a very famous high-end medical doctor at the time who along with myself, was one of the leading teachers for the U.S. Psychotronics Association, and I would meet him there frequently. His wife was quite a piano player, and we had some things in common. And so Dr. Puharich and I would hang out from time to time. And later, then I learned about the relationship, which was a bit antithetical between him and Bentov. And there's a bit of a story to that, Maury, which we may develop today. Basically, remember, Puharich was at that time medically famous for his device, which would piezoelectrically couple the eardrums and enable deaf people to hear. And now I'm going to get those slides out. I'm going to pretend I'm organized here today. So there's Andrea Puharich. And he was later adopted by Phyllis Schlemmer, who's the guy who taught the Star Trek authors how to write Deep Space Nine, among other things, about warp factor versus impulse power. Later, we learned what impulse versus warp power were. And impulse power is literally the impulse of a piezo vortex, either in mercury or water, which if the angle of the vortex is correct, it will compress and then spit out directional longitudinal at the tip of that vortex, literally an impulse, and that's impulse power. Versus warp power, we now know, is how you phase conjugate piezo trigger a piezo crystal, and that crystal will change weight and size as it implodes because of the piezoelectric z-axis, or as in Star Trek, it's called the dilithium crystals, but actually we think it's probably lithium niobate. But these are piezo crystals, which are phase conjugate triggered, and we have a whole lecture on that about beam me up, Scotty. You know, the dilithium crystals are about to. So we knew what warp and impulse meant, and apparently it was Puharich who got that information to Phyllis Schlemmer, which then is how that entered Star Trek. And I have done numerous recordings on the meaning of the nine and Deep Space Nine, and the concept of the nine came directly from Puharich. In fact, just to look at that slide. So I think we're approaching 80-some thousand people who have watched the video, the documentary I did with Elena Danaan on the origin of the idea of Deep Space Nine and the intelligence of the nine, which Elena Danaan refers to all the time, and in the galactic history story, the return of the nine. And here are those slides here. So these are the documentaries I made with Elena Danaan specifically on, and you see the galactic history story and the story of the nine at that time. I think now it's about 80 to 90,000 views. So the plasma physics of that is that at Los Alamos, they had found out that if you take 9 plasma toroids arranged in a stack, like a helix, that they appear to self-organize and become, quote, mindful. Remember, this is Los Alamos Plasma Laboratories that finds why 9 plasma toroids appear to implode and self-organize. It has to do with the 9 golden ratio tetra embedded shadows, which create the Sri Yantra, for example. A bit of a story. Anyway, that is the physics, for example, of why you actually have 9 chakras, 2 above. And so what I pointed out in that story of the 9, that the plasma physics of plasma becoming intelligent when it's arranged in the array of the 9 fits the physics of the history story of the very advanced plasma intelligences called the 9, who Elena says has returned, all of which came from the Andrea Puharich story. Now, I want to tell a little bit more about what Andrea Puharich was famous for at the time, because the way he developed the piezoelectric, and I'm going back to that slide, give me a minute, slide number 129. So the way he developed his device, which was a device for enabling deaf people to hear. Okay, so here you see he would piezoelectrically, he would ring a RF heterodyne, 2 beat note frequencies. And here he's ringing a tooth, but in others, he's ringing the bone behind the ear. And when that frequency ratio hit a certain critical heterodyne, suddenly the deaf person began to hear without an eardrum. And we think the physics is that it's phase conjugate charge implosion, which is the physics of perception in general, because that's where the vortex implodes. For example, when you phase conjugate the brainwaves, kids start to see without their eyes because the plasma vortex called consciousness in their brain comes to a point and enables sorting. And phase lock coheres the longitudinal array, which is clearly the physics of clairvoyance in that case and clairaudience in this case. So what we're saying basically is that not only was he helping deaf people to hear, but he tripped over, and I do mean tripped over, because I don't think he had thought deeply enough about the physics of the coherence of a longitudinal array. This is a discussion of his circuit, but this relates to, for example, why we use bone conduction headphones for max bliss induction with phase conjugate bliss binaural audio triggers,
Mhm.
Flame and Sound app at flameandmind.com.
So he basically, by making him hear, he was also activating them inside their head, right?
See, that's
Awesome.
that's the tricky little coincidence here. In fact, now I'm going to stop this share just so we can have this fun conversation. So, parallel tricky coincidence is, oh, we teach these kids golden ratio cascading in their brain waves, and then they begin to see without their eyes. But by the way, the parents freak out because they start seeing their dead grandmothers.
Mhm.
This is the parallel tricky coincidence, and so what's happening in the case of the kids, we are clear. Golden ratio and octave cascade, alpha to gamma, improved implosion in the brainwave signature, which then gets those fingers of compression squeezing
Mhm.
liquid crystal plasma vortex of charge in your brain synaptic array named consciousness.
Mhm.
that when that vortex, liquid crystal vortex, that comes to a focus, and you call that your consciousness, and you can take it outside your body, and we understand the conditions which enable that. Hint: lucid dreaming, remote viewing, and what you do at death. So this is a very important subject. So what happens is when the vortex implodes correctly,
Mhm.
it coherently prehends, couples with, embeds in the longitudinal array, which is the nest of the nodes of the longitudinal compressional component of the electromagnetic field, which can only inhabit a fractal array. Remember the star of the kit, the Earth grid dodecacosa. So embedding in that larger array means the wind of charge coherently bouncing around in that array requires the fractal nodes in the array. You can only get commercial telepathy at the sacred sites. The Aboriginals call it dreaming tracks, song lines. They would make phone calls to ancestors regularly, but they knew where to do it.
Okay, so we need to bring that to layman's terms for people. So like for myself, I understand because I've had these experiences. But so when I sit there in nature, when I know I'm fully grounded, I'll concentrate on my breath. My breath will come right here. All of a sudden, the plus and the minus, the charge will get right into my head, and then a window will open. Once that window
Exactly.
opens,
Perfect.
so it's through the breath, through just concentration on the breath and bringing your attention right here, because people have to understand that this body and this body is different. This is your first brain. Your stomach is your second brain. Once you go to sleep, if you've ever twitched or rolled over, that's your brain sending a signal. Are you sleeping? You twitch, then it releases. Then it releases. I don't know what you would call it. It's not a toxin. That's what sleep paralysis is. That's so you don't roll around. So once that hits, you're fully there, and you can.
Yeah, and let's focus on what you meant when you said a window opens. Very important point. So what we believe is that, you're inhabiting an array now. It's called the synaptic firing array, the net of fireflies, the Indra's net. But the bigger array, which is the coherence compression points of the longitudinal array of the Earth grid, dreaming track, song line, sacred sites, which is the only place ancestor memories inhabit. The Aboriginals are clear. Those compression zones in that array increase the information density, the sampling capacity of the compression nodes of that array. So when you said you entered the stillness and a window opens, it's an excellent concept to meditate on. Remember, Karatkov and Kozyrev say, oh, if you want commercial telepathy, you got to put these, which is a microwave coherence, the Kozyrev mirror. It's a columnating microwave coherence, the phase conjugate, basically. And then you close your eyes and a window opens. So the window that opens is literally the ability to embed in and coherently sample, literally nest inside of the coherence of that array, which is obviously a hologram, and to sit at the node of that hologram. And you said a window opens, you become coherent within a larger array. And later you can become coherent within a larger array yet. And the physics of how you do that is you get compressional leverage at a still point in the local array and then a larger array. It's called going to the next dimension, but it's a superposed axis of conjugate harmonics. We know that's phase conjugate times Planck, which is Schumann. So
Yeah. So one thing I want to add is that what I've noticed in physical terms, what I've seen my body be able to do. So when I was doing random meditation one day, and I was doing it almost every day at that point, about 2 to 3, 4 weeks every day. And at one point, I was sitting there just doing my breath, and I wasn't really trying to do anything. But then I realized, what am I thinking of? And I thought, I'm not thinking of anything. And I was like, whoa, that's weird. But I realized, like, her voice told me that you need to remember this moment. Remember this moment. You have to be like a good actor that can cry on cue. You need to be able to hit that still point, that not no thought. Boom, you have to be able to remember this. Goes by one day, I get home, my balcony, I was looking at the moonlight, and there's a moon path. And I'm standing there, I'm looking at the moonlight, and I realized, like, wow, like, that still point. I'm not thinking of anything. I'm just taking in the beauty. And I turn around and take one step inside, and the light bulb in the balcony pops. I was like, what was that?
You
Like,
gathered the plasma.
and
Yes.
I didn't think of it. And then I took another step, and then the light bulb inside popped. And I was like, oh, that's me. And I just froze. And I told my girlfriend at the time, don't touch me. I don't know what I can do with this. I don't want to do something I'll regret. I'll shift by tomorrow. By tomorrow, I'll go to sleep. I'll wake up different.
And,
And that was it.
so what happens is that it isn't, I mean, at one level you say you had no thought, but the next thing you said is you felt beauty, which is beautiful because
Yeah.
if you think a thought, which is extremely shareable,
Mm-hmm.
at the leverage of that, for example, now I feel the pain of a billion people, like I understand.
Mm-hmm.
You feel maximum compassion, the yearning, the needs of the whole species. The
Yeah.
needs and yearning of the whole species are embedded in that array holographically. So if you think a pure intention thought, you gather an incredible amount of charge,
Mm-hmm.
popping the bulbs.
Yeah.
So the other thing that's notable, you saw the beam of moonlight, actually a beam of sunlight at sunrise or sunset, especially if cascading off a flat ocean, for example. Ooh, is there
Mm-hmm.
a lot of longitudinal in that, man?
Mm-hmm.
Sunrise, sunset, beam of sun on the water on the horizon, these, the green flash, that whole story. The Sufis say, if you want to see the path up the mountain of enlightenment in Mount Analog, that's the title of the book,
Mm-hmm.
you must illuminate the mountain you need to climb only by the light of the green flash. And then if you
Mm-hmm.
go to the biophysics literature, discover what the physics of the cause of the green flash is. Saw one 2 days in a row at the ocean in Perth, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
It's perfectly phase conjugate horizon, proving that phase conjugation is the reason color exists. The still point of the green flash differentiated. I mean, that's embedding in the array.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah. Anywho, so we were moving toward beautiful examples there, Russ. Thank you. But we were moving toward a Storal to the Mori of Andrei Puharich versus Bentov. And it was Puharich versus Bentov, as I'm about to explain. So so things start to happen to Andrei Puharich, who in the end probably, actually, when he died at Joss Reynolds' estate, it probably was indirectly related to extreme astral hygiene problems. So Andrei Puharich has by that point adopted Uri Geller, and Uri Geller and Andrei Puharich start to have weird things happen, like, oh, the airline tickets for our next trip just fell from the ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
The Puharich Geller stories, if you were there, and I was there for some of it, were extremely colorful. And so Puharich says, we have miracles happen. We're talking to God. It's all wonderful. And Phyllis Schlemmer. And then Bentov is there saying, no, Andrea, you are infested with low-grade spooks. and
Mm-hmm.
and so here's me scratching. Well, who's right here? And I studied this for years, and I found out that my mentor at the time, Ben Bentov, and I had stayed many times in his lab. In fact, I was the one who introduced him to Elizabeth Rauscher on our tour there, and one of the world's most famous scientists who had worked with us for many years. And so, Bentov and I went way back, but I didn't know that he was actually very actively involved in the Arab-Israeli war on the Israeli side. And conversely, I believe that Puharich was kind of on the other side. It was, I mean, it was like Enki versus Enlil all over again. So is it God or is it low-grade spooks? Well, I'm convinced that actually Puharich really did not have good discrimination, but he had very good clairaudience connections. And indirectly, I believe the fact that he had tripped over the physics of clairaudience, which I don't even know if he used the word. I don't think he did. And he certainly did not know that clairaudience and clairvoyance is specifically a spectral bandwidth range within which there is prehension coupling coherence with the longitudinal array. That is obviously the physics of clairvoyance, clairaudience for sure. Anywho, so there's Puharich, and one day he gets a phone call. He gets a lot of phone calls from the other side, and it's this guy named Tom calling, and Tom says this and that and this and that, starts telling the stories, which became the movie, the series Star Trek, literally. Okay, so then later he finds, well, it's not exactly Tom, it's Atum. Now, I don't think even Puharich knew that Atun, basically, if you study my history of the extraterrestrial Anunnaki at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, a complete library of films about Enki and Lil history, you realize that Atun is Enki, Ea, literally. This is where, in the many conversations I had with Elena Danaan, I believe that Elena Danaan's current connection to Ea Enki fits this story actually quite well. And this is where, so Enki Ea basically originally is able to make the phone call to Andre because I believe he was one of the first medical people to trip over the physics of clairaudience, which is the longitudinal array, which is the physics of ET phone calls, the physics of telepathy. And so the sort of the controversy between Bentov and Puharich goes as far back as Enki and Lil, obviously. And when Bentov accused Uri Geller and Puharich of being infested with low-grade spooks, I don't think that Puharich and Geller really knew how to ask the question, with which ET am I making a phone call? And, I call this astral discrimination. And in the end, if you know something about Andrei Puharich's history, he then went to Mexico, where he communicated with incredibly powerful entities. And many of my friends believe that that's indirectly how it kind of went nuts after Josh Reynolds adopted him at the Reynolds Tobacco Estate in, I think it was Georgia area somewhere, where he died. And he died, they say he fell off the roof, but basically he had extreme astral hygiene problems. No one who studied his life could deny that Puharich had extreme astral hygiene problems. He did us a service by initiating communications, yes, but then the astral hygiene that allows you to discriminate with who's making the phone call.
Okay, I have a question. Number one is, when you were around, were there any notable stories that you would sit there and you could literally see either something starts moving, portals start opening, something on like just the weirdest thing that could have happened? Like anything, have you seen any of that?
I had some ET plasma stuff happen to me in Michigan and New York, but my connection to Uri Geller, which was the connection to Puharich here, was when I stayed at Judy Scutch's apartments in New York City many times as she was publishing A Course in Miracles with Helen Schuckman, who wrote The Course in Miracles, with whom I knew quite well, actually. I had that conversation with Helen Schuckman about, well, the medium is the message. Like, how come you wouldn't put your name on Course in Miracles? Well, I'm a statistics professor at NYU. But and you remember, the Course in Miracles it came from a Jewish tradition at the time, and the Course in Miracles said there is no order of difficulty in miracles, which implied you are not supposed to understand, which I felt was a bit disempowering, actually, and goes directly back to the issue of astral hygiene. But relating back to your question, so uh, Judy Scutch's apartment is where Uri Geller always stayed in New York. And although I didn't meet him there, I certainly, heard all the stories. And Uri Geller did something good in this respect. And I think in his later life, for example, he was one of the ones who uh, purportedly measured the fact that focused human attention could reduce radioactive half-life measurably, parallel to the way Professor Bill Tiller measured that focused human attention caused electric fields to compress. I think I was the first one who showed that implosive charge causing electric fields to compress, a correlate to focused human attention, is exactly how you reduce radioactivity, for example, implosive capacitance in the Ark of the Covenant original design to contain the nukes. So I learned a lot there. Anyway, so Uri served many people by getting them. They were doing spoon bending at the time, and to answer your question, so I saw some of that, of course. And he was getting young people to recognize their own psychokinesis, which is a wonderful thing. But then the ability to teach those same young people astral hygiene, question mark.
Right. So with that astral hygiene thing, I would say that I've gone through a life of a lot of being terrorized. Like I mentioned before, till 24, I wasn't even able to sleep with the lights off because I was scared, because I was just so many beings were coming after me at night, from touching me, poking me, to waking up, to some standing there, to all of it. So I realized that we are in the control seat, the creator seat. So when I was watching some video, it might have been one of your videos like 10, 15 years ago. And when I heard about, you have the power, you can control these contracts. They can't touch you without your say so. So the astral hygiene, number one, needs to happen with your concentration of breaking those contracts, breaking the contract and bond between the geometry that you've built with these beings, because that is the power. You are the creator. These beings want to be a creator. They are sub-creators under you. So having that power, I think, is very, very important to pass on to the people.
Nice, nice. And that might lead us indirectly to the last little segment, which I had prepared for today, which was what you're saying when you say you have the power. Remember we said, oh, you get to that still point, compress the breath, implode the harmonics, implode the brain. You get to the still point. At the still point, you have leverage on the tornado. What specifically enables you to steer that tornado? In other words, can you navigate in the resultant lucid dream? Can you navigate among the plasma entities? Can you navigate, et cetera? So it essentially is, what gives you the ability to navigate in the plasma array, whether you call it lucid dreaming, astral projection, remote viewing, or surviving death? It's the same issue. How are you navigating the damn array? And I mean, so I have a story to tell involving Montauk in that regard. But did you want to say something first, Russ? Or
Well, truthfully, like, I've been built for this. So I've had different times where I'm in the astral planes and dreams, and things would happen, and then I'd pop out into the stars, and I'd just be in the stars, and the stars would be moving around me, and then they'd show me symbols. Different, some would be zodiac, more like the Enochian alphabet from Vincent Bridges.
Yes. Nice.
Those symbols, except they'd be multicolored and they'd be changing
Nice.
while they're passing by. And so I knew I would know inside that right now you might not get this, but you keep raising your vibration and your neurological connections, and it will integrate, and you will be able to use the power to steer.
Nice. And I love when you're beginning to see the sacred symbols. So that's one of the little clues here about navigating in the array. Basically, so now we recognize what your consciousness is and exactly what it is. There's no doubt it is a plasma torus. It's a little plasma tornado. That's what you take with you when you die, when you lucid dream, when you remote view. It's clear. It means You ain't taking that inside of some damn aluminum box. No, that will literally kill you. But
Mhm.
if you take that into a sacred forest, you're going to gain inertia during collapse. So you begin to start realizing that when you navigate in the array, it's just like tornadoes. Tornadoes don't like to go over metal trailer parks because that feels like pain because it bleeds their capacitance. No, tornadoes love sacred sites, you know. And so tornado will never destroy a sacred stone circle, but a tornado will always destroy a metal trailer park because that's called
Mhm.
a pain in the ass. but
Mhm.
but so this is a good opportunity for us to think about navigating the array. And since you mentioned you saw some sacred symbols, I
Mhm.
just remind people that now that we know the physics, that the origin of the sacred letters, Hebrew and we think Sanskrit, both in probably Russian Cyrillic, all of those alphabets are literally simply shadows of the self-organizing golden spiral torus vortex on the donut. And
Mhm.
so you change the angle of the spiral on the torus donut and use the tetra to index the tilt angles, and you get the Hebrew and Sanskrit. Hello. Well, why is that so important that it was recorded in the origin of ancient sacred script, Draco language, the star navigators, and actually the symbols from Ophanium Enochian, which were painted, which were the movie Stargate. That's the Ophanium Enochian, which is a hypercube superset of the same spirals. Anywho,
Mhm.
point being, there you are navigating in the array and you're trying to steer. Now, if you was out there in your space capsule and you had to steer your jets,
Mhm.
you need to get the angle of the jet correctly. It's really quite simple. Now, your
Mhm.
optical cortex is obviously a hologram. And remember when the Hebrew rabbi in Prague made a golem, all they had to do was fill the optical cortex one Hebrew letter at a time. So the whole optical cortex is full of the clear focused vision of one single Hebrew letter. What's that doing? It's controlling the tilt angle of the smoke ring you're about to blow.
Mhm.
And the tilt angle of the smoke ring you're about to blow is called how you make the atomic table out of donuts, for one thing. But the other thing is, if you can control the tilt angle of the plasma projection of the implosive jet. So one clue here of navigating in the array when you lucid dream, when you die, visualizing the sacred symbols is you're gradually learning that your power, what's called consciousness, is literally not just non-destructive self-reentry, the physics of Sefer Bereshit, the first word of Genesis,
Mhm.
at first in principle, origin of thingness, the physics of how to turn inside out on the surface of a torus, but also it is enabling the discipline of your inner focus to choose the angle of your plasma jets,
Right.
which is that vortex. Now, which brings me to my Montauk story. But before I do, did you have any other comment?
Yeah. Just what you said until the smoke blow the smoke ring. So what would that kind of translate? Because this is how it happens with me. From being able to generate the energy and do the dance as we have talked about privately before, embodying one letter, one symbol, and that's translating it and encompassing it in the golem or in the water or in the plasma. What does that mean when you're going to blow the smoke ring? How would you, like,
Well,
from the pi to the hex, pen to the hex? What
well,
is the
obviously, the one single Hebrew letter is only simply a non-redundant uh, phase locked shadowgram of
right?
one angle only of a spiral on a torus. So
Right.
the Hebrew letters are all the shadow of the same thing, except you change the angle of tilt. So you've absolutely controlled the angle of the smoke ring.
Right.
Now, the other thing, which is how you blow your jets, control the angle of your jets. But the other thing to know is if you've ever done a horse whisperer, there you are visualizing the next move for the horse. But the horse don't get your telepathy until you stamp your foot ground and release the donut. I mean the hologram. I mean the picture. I mean the telepathy. I mean the visualization. So
Right.
until you learn how to release your donut, you ain't blown your smoke ring.
So right there, that's okay. Like in business, I've noticed certain algorithms where I'd be if I if I make a deal with someone and then I think about the deal or overthink it, deal doesn't happen. But if I make a deal and it's just like spontaneous and boom, shook hands and I forget about it or just let it out, just kind of shift my focus, that deal will happen.
Yeah, especially if you ground it at the right moment, which gave it gain energy during collapse inertia. And the process of releasing requires one other little detail, which is called pure intention. I mean, becoming a distributable wave. I mean, heaven. I mean, so if the intent was pure and there was grounding, then that is absolutely a distributable wave, which is how you translate the physics of the word heaven, hey ave. So pure intention just means that this was a shareable, means because into that array is only the library of collective symmetry survival information. Nothing else can embed in that array. That's why you have to compress well at depth, because nothing can go into the array, which is not pure shareability. Pure principle. Anyway, it's our pure intent.
I got it.
But pardon? Wait, well, Val wants to know more about creating the golem. Well, the idea about the golem was, the legend was, the rabbi was creating a plasma entity, but unfortunately did not have a soul, but did have a zip line to the priest, the rabbi, who created it. So actually, the golem story is not the story of ensoulment, but it was the story of creating plasma entities. And it actually isn't that much of a happily ever after, and is an example of astral hygiene limitation. But the physics of ensoulment goes, if you know the young Jesus story, when he made the clay figurine of the bird, and then he said, "Fiat lux," and suddenly the bird flew away. That's a little deeper, but then you have to pop the quiff and implode the synapse. It's a little more to that one. But
that will be the next time we talk.
But when the pure intention is deep enough. But so now we have to do our climax story here.
Yeah, let's do this.
Okay. So the climax story. Actually, I have this slide here. Let's see if the last slide. This is the last slide in the climax story. Yeah, it's the story of Michael Ash, the time navigator, the steerer of the time chair, whom I knew to some extent, at Montauk. Now remember, our issue of the moment is you get into that array and how do you steer? Remember? And remember the Draco named Charlie who ran Montauk, who was abducting only the human teenagers who were lucid dreamers, who knew how to steer the array, who were psychokinetic, the origins of the SSP secret space program. Sorry. And so, and we knew many of the Montauk survivors, Stuart Swerdlow and all those people. So the Adventures of Michael Ash story, and you can find this at goldenmean.info/ash. And basically, the short version of this story is that the person who was most able to, quote, steer the time chair, and that's the issue that's the story I want to tell here. So first of all, what was meant by the time chair? Classically, you're in the middle of a dodecahedron high voltage plasma antenna called a movie Contact? No. Or maybe you're in the middle of an octahedral plasma antenna called Decadelta by Preston Nichols. Same principle. It's phase conjugate charge implosion, creating a still point, ideally in the array. And remember, Montauk Island was used by the shaman of the Montauk Indians for time travel for hundreds of years before Montauk. What does that tell you? Doorway into the array. And the other thing is, only the teenagers who had serious psychokinesis, lucid dreaming capabilities were able to sit in the implosive center of that still point of that implosive capacitor and not just embed in that array and steer. And I've always asked that you do please meditate on the question of why they named the executive role of the person sitting in that time chair. The name for that position was called the time empath. Embed in the path. as we said many times, Nostradamus sucked the future to himself by weeping for those whom he saw. In other words, compassion, the time empath, which is what gave you ability to gain inertia during collapse and embed more centripetally into the array, enabling you to steer. So sitting in that implosive capacitor is very much like lying still on your bed. And just when you're about to sleep and you're feeling lots of tingle and charge and presence, instead of sleeping, you embed into the array and you begin to lucid dream. That switch, the switch that it takes to have that discipline at that moment, the skill to enter the array, which is the skill to enter the lucid dream and steer, is obviously and clearly the only physics of lucid dreaming, astral projection, remote viewing, and surviving death. Hello. So how do you steer? The other little piece of the story that we often enjoy telling is, remember that, when the Klutzes who built the Philadelphia experiment had the two generators on the side of the ship and their only goal was disappearing from radar, but instead they disappeared altogether because they didn't phase lock the 180 degrees correctly between the two generators opposite side of the ship. But as Elizabeth Bill Donovan always likes to say, the sailors in that ship who time traveled that day, most of them went to, guess where? The barroom on the coast of where they were all dreaming to go on their leave the coming weekend. That's where they went. So their yearning was how they steered into the array. Hint, hint.
Well, is there any okay, so the time empaths, is there any stories that you have about that time empath, whichever ones have been put in there? Maybe some have now grown into big positions in the government, maybe anything of those sorts?
Well, a couple little points to be made. The Draco named Charlie, who was well, I won't say an asshole, but he was not a nice guy, who was apparently running the joint at the time, if you believe Michael Ash, whom I talked to. By the way, that's a pen name. How come the Dracos were not steering the time chair themselves? Because they couldn't. Oops. Why did they have to abduct the teenagers to do it? Looking for a heart of gold and growing old? Oh, Humpty Dumpty's egg, they couldn't reassemble the pieces, even though the Dracos massaged the royal families of Europe for 1,000 years trying to make Humpty Dumpty's egg like they were show dogs, but they couldn't make a soul. Oh. So the ones who could steer that time chair had enough presence. Some people call it presence of mind, but it's deeper than that. At in the Star Wars series, I believe this was called microchloridians in the blood. Montauk, they claimed to measure it, and they named it boson 7. Now, I believe what they called boson 7 at Montauk was specifically a spectrum analysis, which probably extended into the microwave, which indicated the recursive onset of braid coherence implosively in the DNA, which is how you make a soul. I mean, get longitudinal coherence. Do you see what I'm saying?
But okay, so they were trying to make a soul. So Humpty Dumpty's egg was like, in my mind, that's ready. I remember you talking about it, but it's only resonating with like clones, making a clone, actually birthing something.
All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty, couldn't put the bumps on the surface of the egg correctly back together. It's called laws of form, and where the spectrum analysis of the surface of the membrane tells you not just if it's implosive, not just whether you got cancer, but whether you got a soul. Because remember, Bruce Lipton got one thing right. The membrane is the brain, and the power spectrum of the brain, Humpty Dumpty's egg, is a spectrum analysis that indicates how not just harmonic inclusiveness and measures immune health, but also measures you got a soul because it ain't imploding or otherwise. So whether it's the membrane or the DNA, it's got to be implosive enough to give you leverage to embed and steer in the array. And that we believe is measurable. In fact, when I'm going to say this on the record. When Bob Dratch said that Donald Rumsfeld stole not just the invention of GPS from him, but the invention of microwave spectrum analysis, replacing every hospital scanner, and there was a microwave scanning emissions technology that Bob Dratch invented, and Donald Rumsfeld stole it from him and said, "You go to jail if you ever mention it." Typical Donald Rumsfeld. But essentially, the reason that was such a big secret is that would tell you who had a soul. Oh my goodness. You
Mm.
think the Dracos would like that? No. It's like
Right,
them.
right, right.
It's like them blue glasses that tell you who has an aura and therefore who has a soul. There's real physics there from They Live. So the point is here that when the implosive coherence in the area, in the aura, gives you enough leverage on the array, you can then steer. And the theory, this is maybe the final thought here. In the same
Mhm.
way that with me, 30 years of Kundalini, the more I had access to bliss in Kundalini, the more I became sensitive to my clairaudience improved. I'm still not really good at it, but my clairaudience and my ability to feel magnetic lines. I can walk up to a field, a quarter square mile of field, and I can tell you where the magnetic cross points are from a distance because my inner voice knows exactly. So the more you became sensitive to the array becomes part of you, microchloridians in the blood or boson 7, the more you have that implosive capability in your membrane, in your glandular motion, in your recursive DNA braiding. And that is why access to bliss is so critical for young people trying to get an immune system. Just as we said, if you can teach your young people how to have a bliss experience, that is the only definition of culture if you're an Aboriginal.
Mhm.
Because
I actually
otherwise,
saw
no immune system.
you when there's two things I want to say. Number one is I actually saw when we were when I was with you. I saw when you put on that band and it was the I Thrive, right? Or where the EKG.
Flame in mind,
Like,
brainwave.
so when we were looking at it, and when you put it on, and I saw your theta wave was off the charts.
Yeah,
It
low
all made
frequency.
sense. It made sense to me why I could be in another room talking to Val about whatever, and you'll be in the other room. You'll hear everything, doing something. Like your focus is here, but you hear everything. It's just like it was
Yeah.
kind of. I was like, wow, he's definitely in the subconscious mind, like almost a dream and awake at the same time, walking around with
Well,
huge perception.
you can see my records in that regard at flameinmind.com, and it's very true. The alpha, beta, theta, and delta, the low frequency theta particularly, I have huge low frequency capability there, which classically means I would have access to the collective unconscious. And it's true, on my good days when I have discipline, I can speak with certain ancestors. It's true. Unfortunately, actually, my gamma way up high is not particularly good, which means actually that I'm not that good a lucid dreamer, and I'm not that good at you know, the clairvoyance. So I get clairaudience, yes, but clairvoyance is a bit limited in my case. And by the way, I had a discussion with my mother, ThelmaWinter.com, who's a famous artist, actually after her death. I had a discussion with
Mm,
incredible media about why I inherited clairaudience and not clairvoyance
hmm.
from the ancestor memory. And basically the answer was, well, it might have been too distracting. But my mother, a very famous artist, very successful, was that way because of incredible clairvoyance indirectly, which would show in her pictures. So
Hmm.
my ability to get the low frequency means that then I do have some access to ancestor memory. And you can get there too. And the more Kundalini, more bliss you have access. Well, final thought I would say is that yearning that I then have intensely, let me just give
Hmm.
an example. I have to walk over here and turn off the refrigerator about every third hour because I'm intensely aware of what it's doing to my aura when I'm trying to be clairaudience. So I have to get this room like I have to turn all the gadgets off, and then I'm on a magnetic line. And when all the gadgets are off and I have crystal, pristine silence, I can
Hmm.
feel that mountain down the road. And it's like my whole aura has embedded in the array. And, this is food for my soul. So, on the surface, that means I'm hyposensitive to audio. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention was about the nine, because I've always had this weird thought where I looked at the seven chakras and I was like, well, then what is the legs? What is under and below, like above and under? So I saw that there's a chakras, but
Yeah.
then when I walk, I imagine my legs are brown with like roots. Every time I step on the ground, the roots are lighting up, going in and out. Now below me, it almost looks like half an egg, and then like antlers, like almost like going up. So it's half an egg into like antlers, and in the middle would be a silver ball, and that's below me. And above me would be the same thing, a white one with a gold ball. And that's where I walk. That's how I envisioned it ever since I was young. That's how I saw it, and that's what I think of when I walk.
Ah, that's great. So it's kind of a relationship you have with the geometry of your own aura, which is what you
Yeah.
take with you when you're shamanically plasma projecting. Very useful visualization. And those legs clearly reflect the physics here, which is that if you don't have access to fractal distribution and grounding, you do not get leverage. So the
Mhm.
fractality of and when you walk on sacred earth, you gain lots of leverage. And when you walk on metal sidewalks in poisonous cities, you lose lots of leverage, man. It's very real, immediate, and direct response. And the other final thing I would say is you can see the pictures of the Los Alamos Plasma Research Lab on the plasma physics of the nine. There's many
Mhm.
slides in that film. Of course, I did with Elena Denon, 90,000 viewers, or goldenmean.info/whale dreamers, WHALE dreamers. Whale Dreamers. It's a Whale Dreamer song. And you see the whole Los Alamos story with Tony Peratt and my friend
Mhm.
John McGovern in Australia, who discovered this. So Los Alamos found out the nine is plasma physics, and then later we find out the nine is a very intelligent being, essentially because there are two plasma donuts above your body with this eighth and ninth chakra. And you can
Mhm.
feel it. I mean, I can feel this one right here. Boy, do I feel that one.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, I feel that one, man. So,
Mhm.
you've assembled your nine
Mhm.
implosively, self-organizing plasma, and then you steer that array beautifully relating to it, just as you said. The antlers are the antenna, the vortex cone above, and the trees of the fractality of your legs as grounding below. Very useful, appropriate visualization. Nice one, Russ.
Mhm. Always.
So that was the happily ever after, guys. I think that's our story for today. So the story of the Maury is we don't actually need to remember the names of all the personalities here, but the pure principles of how we gain the hygiene to navigate our aura as we go into lucid dreaming and remote viewing and successful death is a very real principle that when you visualize where your aura is going, you will gain energy in nature and you will lose energy in electrosmog in ugly cities. And that is true whether you're in your body or you're in your aura, both ways. So you basically are learning that everything you do, as Castaneda said, is you look for your place of power before you sit down in any room because you need to implode or die. Okay, guys. Well, thank you, Russ. We hope this
Love
was
and
a happily
blessings.
ever after. Thank you. See
Bye.
you soon. Bye. Bye.